June 8th, 795. Dawn broke cold and grey over the rocky shores of Rathlin Island, a wind-swept outcrop clinging to the northeastern coast of Ireland. The monks of the small monastery awakened to their prayers, unaware that their world was about to change forever. From the mist emerged shapes that would haunt Irish nightmares for the next 2 centuries. Sleek wooden vessels with high, curving prows sliced through the morning fog, their oars cutting the water in perfect rhythm. These were Viking Longships, and the Age of Terror had arrived in Ireland. The dragon heads carved into their prows weren't mere decoration. They were psychological weapons designed to strike fear into anyone who saw them. As the ships beached on the rocky shore, warriors poured out, tall, heavily armed Norsemen who moved with the confidence of men who had crossed the North Atlantic. The monastery had no defences, no walls, no armed guards. Why would it need them? This was a house of God. The Vikings didn't care about God, at least not the Christian one. What they cared about was the gold chalices, the illuminated manuscripts with their jewelled covers, the silver reliquaries, and most importantly the people who could be sold as slaves across the Viking world. The raid lasted less than an hour. By the time the sun had fully risen, the longships were gone, leaving behind burning buildings and bodies. But they would return. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the opening move in a campaign that would reshape Ireland forever. The same year, Vikings struck Inishmurray off the coast of Sligo and Inishbofin near Galway. These weren't random attacks by lost sailors. They were calculated strikes by experienced raiders who had studied their prey carefully. The question that historians have grappled with for centuries is simple. How did a relatively small population of Scandinavian warriors terrorize and ultimately transform one of Europe's most developed Christian kingdoms? The answer lies not in Viking savagery, though they were certainly capable of brutal violence, but in the revolutionary ship technology that carried them across the seas. The Viking longship wasn't just a boat. It was a weapon system unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. To understand the Viking raids on Ireland, you first have to understand the longship itself. These vessels represented centuries of Nordic shipbuilding tradition, refined to absolute perfection. The earliest ancestors of the Viking longship appeared in Scandinavian rock carvings dating back to the Bronze Age, but the designs that terrorised Ireland emerged around the 8th century. The Gvalsund ship, discovered in Norway and dated to approximately 780, shows the design principles already in place. 18 metres long, just over 3 metres wide, powered by 10 pairs of oars with a single square sail. This was the template that would evolve into the Dragons of the Sea. The construction of a Viking longship was a masterpiece of engineering that modern boat builders still struggle to replicate. The process began with the keel, a single massive timber of oak carved into a T or Y shape. This wasn't just the foundation of the ship, it was the spine from which everything else would grow. The keel had to be absolutely straight, carved from what the Norse called deadwood, timber that had been cut and seasoned to prevent warping during construction. At each end of the keel, the shipwrights attached the stem and stern posts, curving pieces of oak that rose dramatically upward, often carved into dragon or serpent heads. The hull itself was built using a technique called clinker construction, also known as lapstrake building. Unlike later European ships that built a frame first and attached planks to it, Viking shipwrights started with the outer shell. Each plank, called a strake, overlapped the one below it by about an inch. These weren't modern machine-cut boards. They were radially split from oak logs using axes and wedges, a technique that followed the grain of the wood and created planks of incredible strength. A single oak tree 2 centuries old could yield 60 or more planks. The planks were fastened together with iron rivets, 3 inches long, hammered through both layers of wood and secured with circular washers on the inside. Every 6 to 8 inches, another rivet. On a longship 70 feet long, that meant thousands of individual iron fastenings, each one hand-forged by skilled blacksmiths. Between the overlapping planks, shipwrights stuffed wool or animal hair coated in pine tar to create a watertight seal. The tar came from heating pine roots in earthen pits, a process that produced a thick black substance that never fully hardened, allowing it to flex with the wood as the ship moved through the water. Here's where Viking ship design became truly revolutionary. The strakes below the waterline were incredibly thin, less than 1.25 inches thick on vessels like the Gokstad ship. Modern shipwrights look at these measurements and shake their heads. It seems impossible that such thin wood could withstand the forces of ocean waves. But the clinker construction created a hull that flexed and bent with the sea rather than fighting against it. The overlapping planks could shift slightly, absorbing stress and distributing it across the entire structure. It was like the difference between a rigid stick that snaps and a flexible branch that bends. Only after the outer shell was complete did the shipwrights add the internal framework. Ribs cut from naturally curved wood, roots and branches that had grown into the right shapes, were lashed or pegged to the planks. These ribs weren't load-bearing in the way we think of ship frames today. They were there to maintain the hull's shape and provide attachment points for the deck and rowing benches. The real strength of the ship came from the planked shell itself. One strake in particular deserves special mention. The Norse called it the meginhufa, which translates roughly as the strong strake. This was positioned at or just below the waterline, thicker than the others, often twice as thick, and made from the longest single piece of timber the shipwrights could find. The meginhufa acted like a longitudinal girder, distributing the lateral forces from waves and keeping the ship's flexible hull from deforming under stress. The mast was another marvel of engineering. Stepped into a massive block of oak called the mast fish, which was itself wedged between the ribs and resting on the keel, the mast could be raised and lowered. This was crucial for river navigation. When Vikings sailed up the Shannon or the Liffey to raid inland monasteries, they could drop the mast to pass under bridges or through forested areas. The sail itself was woven from wool, often in strips of different colours, creating distinctive patterns. Each sail represented hundreds of hours of work by women back in Scandinavia. The wool was woven so tightly that when wet it became nearly waterproof, and the natural lanolin in the wool helped it shed water. A single sail for a large longship required wool from over 200 sheep. The rowing positions were carefully planned. Each man had his assigned bench, his cess in Old Norse. The oarlocks weren't the rotating metal devices we use today. They were simple holes cut through one of the upper strakes, with the inside edges lined with leather to reduce friction. When the oars weren't in use or when the ship was under sail, the holes could be covered with circular wooden discs to keep water out. On a typical longship designed for raiding, there might be 20 to 30 rowing positions per side, meaning 40 to 60 oarsmen. These weren't slaves or pressed men. They were free warriors who took pride in their skill with the oar. Rowing in perfect unison across stormy seas required strength, endurance, and coordination that took years to develop. The steering was managed by a single large oar mounted on the right side near the stern. This is why the right side of a ship is still called starboard, a corruption of steerboard. The steersman stood on a small raised platform at the stern, the lipting, from where he could see over the heads of the rowers and judge the waves and wind. A skilled steersman was worth his weight in silver. In the treacherous waters around Ireland, with their hidden rocks and sudden currents, navigation required intimate knowledge of the sea and an almost supernatural ability to read the water. But the most important feature of the Viking longship, the characteristic that made the raids on Ireland possible, was its shallow draught. A fully loaded longship carrying 60 warriors, weapons, supplies, and loot drew less than 3 feet of water. Think about that. A 70-foot vessel carrying 3 tons of men and equipment could float in water barely waist-deep. This meant Vikings could beach their ships on any sandy or pebbly shore. They didn't need harbours or docks. They could sail up rivers that Irish defenders thought impassable. They could reach monasteries and settlements that believed themselves safe because they weren't on the coast. The shallow draught turned all of Ireland into accessible raiding territory. The speed of these ships was terrifying to their victims. Under oar power in calm water, a longship could maintain 5 to 6 knots for hours, with bursts up to 10 knots. Under sail with a following wind, they could reach 15 knots. For comparison, most medieval merchant vessels were lucky to make 3 or 4 knots. Vikings could appear out of nowhere, raid a monastery, and be gone before word of the attack could reach the nearest Irish king. They could cross the North Sea from Norway in as little as 3 days. The Irish Sea from Viking settlements in Scotland or the Isle of Man could be crossed overnight. The longship's design also made it reversible. The bow and stern were almost identical, both ending in high, curved posts. This meant the ship didn't have to turn around to retreat. The rowers could simply switch which direction they pulled, and the steersman could operate from either end. In a combat situation or when escaping from an attack, this reversibility was invaluable. Vikings could raid a settlement, push their ships back into the water stern first, and be rowing away before defenders organised a counterattack. Now, imagine you're an Irish monk living in the early 9th century. Your monastery sits on the banks of the Shannon 20 miles inland. You believe you're safe from the sea raiders who have been troubling the coast. One morning you hear shouting from the river. You rush to the bank and there they are. 3 longships, their dragon prows pointed toward your monastery, 60 warriors standing ready with axes and spears. Your monastery has no walls. Your fellow monks are scholars and scribes, not soldiers. In less than an hour, everything your community has built will be taken or destroyed. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario. This was the reality that repeated itself across Ireland for 2 centuries. The first phase of Viking raids, from 795 to around 820, followed a consistent pattern. Small fleets, usually 3 to 10 ships, would strike coastal monasteries in hit-and-run attacks. These early raids targeted islands and peninsulas, places that could be reached quickly from the sea and abandoned just as fast. Rathlin Island, Lambay Island, Inishmurray, Inishbofin. The list of raided sites grew each year. The Vikings came in summer when the seas were calmer and the days were long. They struck without warning, usually at dawn or dusk when defenders were least prepared. They took what they could carry, killed anyone who resisted, captured valuable hostages for ransom, and took young, healthy men and women as slaves. Then they were gone, back to their bases in the Hebrides or Norway. The targets weren't random. Monasteries in early medieval Ireland were far more than religious centres. They were the economic, cultural and political hubs of Irish society. Places like Clonmacnoise, Glendalough and Armagh held vast lands, collected tithes from surrounding territories, and housed treasuries filled with gold, silver and precious manuscripts. The monks themselves were often from noble families. A captured abbot could be ransomed for a fortune. But more valuable than the loot were the people. The Viking slave trade was a vast commercial enterprise that stretched from Dublin to Constantinople. Irish slaves, particularly women valued for their pale skin and light hair, commanded premium prices in markets across the Viking world and beyond. Irish chronicles from this period are filled with anguished descriptions of these raids. The Annals of Ulster record that in 798, Innis Padraig was burned by heathens and they took the cattle tribute of the territories and broke the shrine of Dochona. In 802, Iona was burned. In 806, the community of Iona, to the number of 68, was killed by heathens. These weren't just numbers in a ledger. Each entry represented communities destroyed, lives shattered, centuries of accumulated knowledge burned or carried away. The psychological impact on Irish society was profound. The Vikings seemed to come from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. They struck with a speed and ferocity that medieval warfare wasn't prepared to counter. Traditional Irish military tactics focused on cattle raids, ambushes, and small-scale conflicts between rival kingdoms. The Irish had warriors, certainly, but those warriors were scattered across hundreds of small kingdoms, each more concerned with their neighbours than with foreign raiders from the sea. But then, around 830, everything changed. The Vikings stopped hit-and-run raiding and escalated to full-scale invasion. In 837, the Annals of Ulster record something that must have seemed apocalyptic to Irish observers. A naval force of the Norsemen 60 ships strong was on the Boyne, and another one of 60 ships on the River Liffey. Those 2 forces plundered the plain of Liffey and the plain of Brega, including churches, forts, and dwellings. 120 longships. That meant somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 Viking warriors had just sailed into the heart of Ireland. These fleets didn't come from Norway. They came from Viking settlements in Scotland and the Hebrides, forward operating bases that the Norse had established over the previous decades. For the first time, the Irish tried to mount organised resistance. The men of Brega gathered an army and confronted one of the Viking fleets. They killed, according to the annals, 60 of the Norsemen, around 120 men. It was a victory, certainly, but a Pyrrhic one. The Vikings had thousands more warriors, and more importantly, they now had a new strategy. Instead of raiding and leaving, they began to overwinter in Ireland. The establishment of the long fort, fortified ship camps, marked a fundamental shift in Viking strategy. The first permanent long fort was established at Dublin in 841. The Irish annalists noted with barely concealed alarm there was a naval camp at Dublin. The following year they wrote with what sounds like shock. The heathens still at Dublin. The Vikings had transitioned from raiders to occupiers. The Longfort served multiple purposes. It was a fortified base where ships could be hauled up safely on the beach, protected by earthwork walls and wooden palisades. It was a winter quarters where the warriors could wait out the storms that made sea travel dangerous. It was a marketplace where loot and slaves could be traded. And crucially, it was a launching point for raids that could be carried out year-round, not just during the summer sailing season. Dublin's location was chosen with strategic brilliance. Situated at the mouth of the Liffey, it controlled access to Ireland's eastern coast. The river was navigable far inland, allowing longships to reach deep into Irish territory. The site itself, where the River Poddle met the Liffey, featured a natural black pool, and Dwpa Linn in Irish, which gave the settlement its name. This pool was deep enough to moor longships safely, protected from storms and hidden from view. Around this pool, the Vikings built the first true town in Ireland. Archaeological excavations in modern Dublin have revealed the remains of this Viking settlement. Post and wattle houses with walls of woven branches covered in mud and dung. Workshops where craftsmen made combs from antler, jewellery from silver, weapons from iron. Wharfs where ships could be built and repaired. Streets laid out in a grid pattern, a revolutionary concept in Ireland where settlements had always been organic and scattered. Other long forts followed. Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick all began as Viking ship camps. Each controlled a major river system. The Shannon, Ireland's longest river, was now a Viking highway reaching deep into the interior, the Swere, the Slaney, the Lee. Vikings could now strike anywhere in Ireland at any time of year. The psychological advantage this gave them was immense. Irish kings had to assume that any day might bring a raid, any river might carry longships filled with warriors. The Vikings who established these settlements weren't all Norwegian. Around 851, a new wave of raiders arrived. The Irish called them the Dubgail, the dark foreigners, to distinguish them from the earlier Fingail, the fair foreigners. Whether these terms referred to their complexions, their hair colour, the colour of their equipment, or simply to the fact that they arrived later is still debated by historians. What's certain is that the Dubgail, probably Danes, arrived in force. The annals of the Four Masters record that they came in 140 ships, attacked Dublin, slaughtered many of the existing Norse settlers, and claimed control of the settlement. This internecine Viking warfare actually benefited some Irish kingdoms. While the Norse fought among themselves, Irish kings had breathing room to regroup and counterattack. Several Irish kings did mount effective resistance. Mael Seshnal Thrall, king of Meath, defeated Viking forces in multiple engagements during the mid-9th century. In 849, he recaptured Dublin briefly, executing hundreds of Viking warriors. But the Vikings always returned. The longships gave them strategic mobility that land-based Irish armies couldn't match. A Viking fleet could avoid a strong Irish army simply by sailing away, then return weeks or months later to strike elsewhere. This strategic flexibility made them nearly impossible to defeat decisively. The Irish adapted to the new reality in various ways. Monasteries that survived began building defences. The round towers that still dot the Irish landscape today were first constructed during this period. These slender stone towers, some reaching over 100 feet tall, had a single door positioned well above ground level, accessible only by ladder. When a raid was spotted, monks would climb into the tower, pull up the ladder, and wait out the attack. The towers couldn't prevent raids, but they provided refuge and prevented the wholesale slaughter that had characterized earlier Viking attacks. Monasteries also began building in stone instead of wood, making them more resistant to fire. Some communities relocated entirely to more defensible locations away from rivers. But perhaps the most significant adaptation was political. Irish kings began hiring Vikings as mercenaries. By the mid-9th century, Viking warriors fought on both sides of Irish conflicts. A king who could afford to hire Norse warriors gained a significant military advantage. The Vikings brought not just fighting skills but naval power. Longships could transport troops quickly, land them behind enemy lines, and provide mobility that traditional Irish warfare lacked. This integration of Vikings into Irish politics blurred the lines between invader and inhabitant, foreign and native. Intermarriage became common. Viking warriors married Irish women. Viking merchants settled permanently in the growing towns. Children born of these unions were something new. the Norse Gaels, people who belonged to both cultures. They spoke both Norse and Irish. They worshipped both Thor and Christ, sometimes in the same household. They fought for Irish kings and against them, depending on politics and profit. By the early 10th century, Dublin was no longer a purely Viking settlement. It was a multicultural trading hub where Norse, Irish, English, and Frankish merchants all mingled. The economic impact of the Vikings on Ireland was profound and often overlooked in favour of stories about raids and battles. Before the Vikings, Ireland had no towns in the European sense. Irish society was rural, organised around extended family groups living on farms and small monastic settlements. The Vikings introduced urbanism. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick became commercial centres engaged in trade networks that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Irish goods, particularly slaves but also cattle, wool and hides, flowed through these Viking towns to markets across the known world. In return, Ireland received silver, weapons, luxury goods, and connections to the broader European economy. The Vikings also brought new shipbuilding techniques to Ireland. The Irish had boats, certainly, but nothing like the Longships. Archaeological evidence from Dublin shows that Irish craftsmen learned Norse shipbuilding methods, reused ship timbers, sketches of ships on wooden planks, and the adoption of Norse nautical terminology into the Irish language all point to a transfer of technology. The Irish word for ship, long, comes from the Norse langskip. Words for oar, mast, and various parts of the ship are all Norse loanwords. This wasn't cultural imperialism. It was recognition that Viking ships were simply superior to anything the Irish had previously built. By the late 10th century, the distinction between Viking and Irish had become increasingly meaningless in practical terms. The great Irish High King Brian Boru, who would eventually confront the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf, employed Norse warriors in his army. The Viking King of Dublin was married to an Irish noblewoman. Trade flowed freely. Norse and Irish lived side by side in the coastal towns. But old enmities die hard, and political ambitions have a way of reigniting ancient conflicts. Brian Boru rose from relatively obscure origins in Munster to become the most powerful king in Ireland. Through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and ruthless determination, he defeated his rivals and claimed the title High King of Ireland around 1002. But his authority was contested, particularly in Leinster and Dublin. The political situation that led to the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 was complex, a tangled web of family feuds, political alliances, and personal ambitions. Brian had been married to Gormleth, an Irish noblewoman with connections to both the Viking King of Dublin and the King of Leinster. After Brian divorced her, Gormleth allegedly encouraged both her brother, the King of Leinster, and her son, the Viking King of Dublin, to rebel against Brian's authority. By 1013, open warfare had erupted. Brian gathered an army drawn primarily from his native Munster, supplemented by allies from Connaught. His opponents assembled a coalition of Leinster Irish and Viking forces from Dublin, supplemented by mercenaries from across the Viking world. Earl Sigurd of Orkney brought warriors from his island domain. Brodeur, a Viking warlord from the Isle of Man, arrived with his fleet. These weren't Irish Vikings. These were professional warriors from the Norse Atlantic world, men who fought for pay and plunder. The promised reward for defeating Brian was control of Ireland itself. The armies met on Good Friday, April 23, 1014, on the coastal plain north of Dublin at a place called Clontarf. The battle was unusual for early medieval Ireland. Most Irish warfare consisted of cattle raids, ambushes and small skirmishes. Clontarf was a full-scale pitched battle involving thousands of warriors fighting hand-to-hand for an entire day. Our knowledge of the battle's details is frustratingly limited. The earliest Irish annals provide only bare outlines. Later accounts, including Icelandic sagas written centuries after the event, embellish the story with supernatural elements and heroic deeds that may or may not be historical. What we know for certain is that Brian's forces won, but at catastrophic cost. Brian himself was killed, allegedly by Brodeur, who found the elderly king praying in his tent and struck him down with an axe. Brian's son Murchad also died, as did his grandson. The Viking Earl Sigurd was killed. Brodeur was captured and executed with extreme brutality. The popular narrative frames Clontarf as the great battle, where Christian Ireland defeated pagan Vikings and ended the Viking Age. This narrative is wrong on almost every level. First, many of the Vikings fighting at Clontarf were Christians, at least nominally. Second, Vikings fought on both sides. Brian's army included Norse warriors from Limerick and possibly Waterford. Third, the battle didn't end Viking presence in Ireland. The Viking king of Dublin, Sigtryg, didn't even fight at Clontarf. He watched from the walls of Dublin, and he continued to rule Dublin for another 2 decades. What Clontarf did end was the possibility of a unified Ireland under a single strong king. Brian's death created a power vacuum that no one could fill. The Vikings remained in their coastal towns, trading and raiding as opportunities arose, but they were no longer a threat to conquer Ireland. They had become Irish, in a sense. The Norse-Gael fusion was complete. The Viking Age in Ireland formally ended around the mid-11th century, not with a dramatic battle, but with a gradual absorption. Viking settlements became Irish towns. Norse warriors converted to Christianity. The great-grandchildren of the raiders who had struck Rathlin Island in 795 spoke Irish, worshipped Christ, and fought in the armies of Irish kings. When the Normans invaded Ireland in 1170, they conquered Dublin, a city built by Vikings but defended by Norse-Irish warriors fighting for an Irish king against Norman invaders who were themselves descended from Vikings who had settled in northern France. History has a sense of irony, but the Longships remained. The technology spread. Irish kingdoms built their own versions. English kings commissioned Norse-style vessels. The design principles developed in Scandinavia, the clinker construction, the flexible hull, the shallow draft, influenced European shipbuilding for centuries. When you look at later medieval cogs, and even some early modern ships, you can see echoes of Viking design in their lines. The archaeological evidence of the Viking Age in Ireland is substantial. Excavations in Dublin, particularly at Wood Quay in the 1970s, revealed thousands of artefacts from the Viking settlement. Combs, tools, coins, weapons, jewellery, the remains of houses and workshops, ship timbers showing the transition from pure Norse construction to hybrid Irish-Norse designs. Burial sites, though rare in Ireland compared to Scandinavia, have yielded weapons, jewellery, and even sacrificed slaves buried with their Norse masters. The evidence paints a picture of a vibrant, multicultural society where Norse and Irish elements blended into something new. The legacy of the Vikings in Ireland extends beyond physical artefacts. Irish surnames with Norse origins, Doyle from Dubgol, Dark Foreigner, MacAuliffe from Son of Olaf, Reynolds from Ragnall. Town names, Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Wicklow, all have Norse etymologies. Legal concepts particularly related to maritime trade and commerce. Artistic styles, the fusion of Celtic interlace with Norse animal motifs produced unique Hiberno-Norse art. Genetic studies show Scandinavian ancestry in Irish populations, particularly in coastal regions. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the transformation of Irish society itself. Before the Vikings, Ireland was isolated, rural, inward-looking. The Vikings forced Ireland to engage with the wider European world. They introduced urbanism, commercial trade networks, and naval power. They demonstrated the importance of mobility and strategic flexibility in warfare. Irish kings who survived and prospered learned these lessons. When later Irish leaders like the Earl of Desmond in the 14th century built fleets of galleys to project power along the coast, they were following Viking patterns established 500 years earlier. The Viking raids on Ireland weren't just about plunder and slaves. They were about the collision of two cultures, the transformation of both, and the creation of something new. The longships that beached on Rathlin Island in 795 carried more than warriors. They carried ideas, technologies, and a connection to the wider world that Ireland had previously lacked. Yes, the Vikings brought violence. They destroyed monasteries, killed monks, enslaved thousands. But they also brought trade, urbanism, and cultural exchange. History is rarely simple. The Vikings in Ireland were neither purely evil raiders nor purely beneficial traders. They were human beings pursuing their own interests in a complex political and economic landscape. The sophistication of the longship technology was matched by the sophistication of Viking strategy. They understood logistics in ways that many of their contemporaries didn't. Establishing permanent bases, the long forts, showed strategic thinking beyond simple raiding. These bases required planning, construction, defence, and provisioning. They needed to be located at strategic points where they could control river access. They needed to be defensible against Irish counterattacks. They needed to be large enough to house not just warriors but craftsmen, merchants, families. The Vikings also showed remarkable political flexibility. When raiding wasn't profitable, they traded. When trading partners became rivals, they fought them. When fighting was too costly, they made alliances. They married into Irish families, adopted Irish customs when convenient, and converted to Christianity when it served their purposes. This adaptability was key to their long-term survival and integration into Irish society. The Vikings, who were still identifiable as such by the 11th century, weren't the same as the raiders of the 9th century. They had evolved, adapted, and in many ways become Irish themselves. The Longship made all of this possible. Without that revolutionary technology, Viking raids on Ireland would have been limited to the coastal fringe. The ability to sail up rivers, to beat ships on any shore, to carry sufficient warriors to overwhelm local defences, and to escape before reinforcements arrived. All of this depended on the unique characteristics of the Longship design. The shallow draft, the reversible ends, the combination of oar and sail power, the flexibility of the clinker-built hull. Each of these features contributed to a weapon system that gave Vikings capabilities their enemies couldn't match. Modern reconstructions of Viking longships have demonstrated their remarkable performance. The Sea Stallion, a replica of the Skulderlev II ship, sailed from Denmark to Ireland in 2007, retracing the route Viking raiders would have taken over 1,000 years earlier. The crew reported that the ship handled beautifully, even in rough seas. The flexible hull absorbed wave action rather than fighting it. The shallow draft allowed navigation in waters where modern yachts would ground. The speed under sail exceeded expectations. The Sea Stallion demonstrated that the Viking achievement wasn't just cultural or military, it was technological. The Longship was, for its time, as revolutionary as the aircraft carrier or the nuclear submarine would be in later eras. Imagine standing on the walls of an Irish monastery in 840. You've heard the stories of the Norse raiders, but your community is 20 miles inland, up a river that you believe is too shallow for seagoing vessels. Then, one summer morning you see them, dragon heads rising above the morning mist, longships, 3 of them, rowing against the current, their shallow drafts allowing them to navigate waters where no ship has gone before. 60 warriors, armed with axes and swords, ready to take everything you have. This was the terror of the Viking Age, not the violence itself. Medieval Europe was violent everywhere, but the knowledge that nowhere was safe. No river too shallow, no distance too great, no season too harsh. The longships could reach you anywhere, any time. The Irish eventually adapted. They built their own fleets, they fortified their settlements, they hired Viking mercenaries to fight Vikings, they integrated Norse technology and tactics into their own military systems. But this adaptation took time, and the cost in lives, treasure, and cultural heritage was immense. How many illuminated manuscripts were destroyed? How many works of art melted down for their silver? How many people carried away to slavery? We'll never know the full accounting, but we also must acknowledge what was gained. The urban centres that Vikings founded became the economic engines of medieval Ireland. The trade networks they established connected Ireland to markets from Constantinople to Iceland. The genetic and cultural fusion of Norse and Irish created the complex hybrid society that exists today. When Irish Americans celebrate both St. Patrick and Viking heritage, they're acknowledging a historical reality. Ireland is a product of both Celtic monasticism and Norse maritime culture. The Longship, then, was more than a wooden vessel. It was the physical embodiment of Viking ambition and capability. It represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about seafaring, shipbuilding, and naval warfare. It was a technology that couldn't be easily copied or countered. It gave the Vikings a mobility and strategic flexibility that allowed a relatively small population to project power across vast distances. From 795 to 1014, these ships carried warriors, traders, settlers, and ultimately a transformation. They connected Ireland to the wider world. They forced Irish society to adapt and evolve. They demonstrated that technology, properly applied, could overcome numerical and geographical disadvantages. Today, when you walk through Dublin or Waterford or any of Ireland's coastal cities, you're walking on foundations laid by Vikings over 1,000 years ago. The street patterns, the harbours, the commercial districts all bear the mark of Norse influence. The DNA of millions of Irish people carries Scandinavian markers. The English language as spoken in Ireland contains Norse loanwords. The legacy of the Longship isn't just in museums and archaeological sites, it's woven into the fabric of modern Ireland. The raids began in 795 with a few ships striking an island monastery. They ended 2 centuries later with complete cultural integration. The longships that beached on Rathlin Island carried warriors. The longships that sailed from Dublin in the 11th century carried merchants, diplomats and soldiers who were as much Irish as Norse. This transformation, violent and traumatic as it often was, demonstrated a fundamental truth about human societies. They're never static. Contact between cultures, even violent contact, produces change. Technology spreads, ideas merge, people adapt. The Viking Age in Ireland wasn't a story of conquest and defeat, it was a story of collision and fusion. The longships were the instruments of that transformation. They brought the Vikings to Ireland, and in doing so, they changed both cultures forever. The transformation of Viking warfare in Ireland reached new sophistication by the mid-9th century. The early raiders who struck monasteries had operated with crude tactics, overwhelming speed and surprise against unprepared targets. But as Irish resistance organised, Viking strategy evolved. Fleet commanders began coordinating attacks across multiple locations simultaneously, forcing Irish kings to divide their forces. In 848, the Annals of Ulster record that Vikings raided from the mouth of the River Boyne to the southern coast, striking settlements hundreds of miles apart within days of each other. This required not just individual ship captains acting independently, but a coordinated command structure planning operations across Ireland's entire coastline. The logistics of sustaining these extended campaigns were formidable. A single longship carrying 60 men required approximately 200 pounds of food per day. Fresh water was even more critical. Each warrior needed at least a gallon daily, meaning a single ship required 60 gallons of potable water every day. For a fleet of 20 ships, that meant 1,200 men consuming nearly 2.5 tons of food and supplies daily. Vikings couldn't carry enough provisions for extended voyages. They had to resupply constantly. This necessity drove much of their raiding behaviour. Monasteries and coastal settlements weren't just sources of treasure. They were sources of food, livestock and fresh water. The annals frequently mention Vikings seizing cattle, grain stores and provisions. These weren't afterthoughts. They were essential to sustaining the raiding economy. The slave trade that Vikings pioneered in Ireland deserves deeper examination because it reveals the economic calculations underlying the raids. Early medieval Europe had various forms of unfree labour, but large-scale chattel slavery had largely disappeared after the Roman Empire's collapse. The Vikings reinvigorated the slave trade on a massive scale. Dublin became one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. Irish captives, particularly women and children, were transported across the Viking world. Young women were prized in Scandinavian markets, where chronic female shortages existed due to selective infanticide and the hazards of childbirth. Skilled craftsmen, literate monks and healthy young men went to labour markets across the North Atlantic and beyond. Some Irish slaves ended up as far away as Constantinople, sold through intermediary markets in Eastern Europe. The profit margins were extraordinary. A Viking warrior might capture 12 people in a single raid. Each captive, if successfully transported to market, could sell for several ounces of silver. A successful raiding season could net profits equivalent to 10 or 20 years of farming income back in Norway. This economic incentive explains why Vikings kept returning to Ireland year after year, generation after generation. The raids weren't mindless violence, they were profitable business enterprises. The longship was the delivery mechanism for a sophisticated commercial operation built on violence and human trafficking. Irish responses to Viking raiding evolved beyond passive defence. Several Irish kings launched counter-raids against Viking settlements. In 848, Mael Secnail, king of Meath, attacked the Longfort at Dublin, killed hundreds of Vikings and freed a large number of Irish and foreign captives. The annals specify that he released both Irish prisoners and Saxon slaves, revealing that Vikings were raiding Britain and Ireland simultaneously, using Dublin as a central slave depot. These Irish offensive operations demonstrated that Vikings weren't invincible. Their settlements, once established, became vulnerable to the same kind of surprise attacks they had inflicted on Irish monasteries. But the fundamental problem Irish kings faced was naval power. Vikings could retreat to their ships and sail away from any land-based counterattack. Irish armies could burn a long fort, but they couldn't prevent Vikings from simply establishing a new one elsewhere. This strategic mobility meant Vikings retained the initiative. They chose when and where to fight. Irish kings had to react defensively, never knowing where the next attack would come. This asymmetry explains why Viking raids continued successfully for so long despite determined Irish resistance. The technology, the longship itself, created an imbalance that Irish military forces couldn't overcome without developing their own naval capabilities. Some Irish leaders tried. The annals mention several instances of Irish kings commissioning fleets. In 866, Eadred Findleath, High King of Ireland, led a naval expedition against Viking forces in the north. But Irish shipbuilding hadn't caught up to Norse standards. The vessels Irish kings could field were smaller, slower, and less seaworthy than Viking longships. It would take generations of technological transfer before Irish shipwrights could build vessels capable of matching Viking performance. By that time, the strategic situation had changed entirely. The Vikings had transitioned from raiders to settlers, and their ships had evolved from weapons of conquest to tools of trade. The establishment of year-round Viking settlements fundamentally altered Irish society. Dublin by the late 9th century had become a true urban centre, with a permanent population exceeding several thousand. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive metalworking, including sophisticated bronze casting and iron forging. Workshops produced jewellery, tools, weapons, and the specialised fittings required for ship construction. Coopers made barrels. Leatherworkers produced shoes, belts, and armour components. Weavers created sailcloth. The division of labour and craft specialisation found in Viking Dublin was unprecedented in Ireland. Irish society had skilled craftsmen certainly, but they worked individually or in small monastery workshops. Dublin represented industrial production on a scale Ireland had never seen. Trade networks radiating from Dublin connected Ireland to the broader Viking world. Silver flowed in massive quantities through Dublin's markets. Much of this silver came from the Islamic world, minted in Baghdad, Samarkand and other Middle Eastern cities, then carried north through Russian river systems by Swedish Vikings, the Rus, who controlled the trade routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea. These Arabic coins, called dirhams, appear in archaeological hoards throughout Viking Ireland. The presence of Middle Eastern silver in 9th century Dublin demonstrates the astonishing reach of Viking trade networks. An Irish slave captured in a monastery raid might be sold in Dublin for silver that originated 2,000 miles away in the Abbasid Caliphate. Luxury goods from across the known world appeared in Viking Dublin: silk from Byzantium, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory from the Arctic, wine from Francia, whetstones from Norway prized for sharpening weapons, glass beads from the Rhineland. This wasn't just Vikings importing luxuries for themselves. Irish elites were eager customers. Kings and nobles who fought Vikings on the battlefield also traded with them in the marketplace. The archaeology reveals this complex relationship. Viking-style jewellery appears in purely Irish contexts. Irish metalwork shows Norse stylistic influences. The boundaries between cultures were porous and constantly shifting. The Norse language left permanent marks on Irish speech, particularly in maritime and commercial terminology. The Irish word for penny, pingin, comes from Norse. Margad, the Irish word for market, derives from the Old Norse word for the same. Dozens of nautical terms entered Irish from Norse, but linguistic influence flowed both ways. Norse speakers in Ireland adopted Irish words, particularly for agricultural practices and local geography. By the 10th century, a hybrid dialect probably emerged in Dublin and other trading towns, mixing Norse and Irish vocabulary and grammar. This linguistic fusion mirrored the cultural and genetic mixing happening among the population. Intermarriage between Norse and Irish became common enough that a new identity emerged: the Norse Gaels or Golgoidal. These people occupied an ambiguous position in both cultures. To pure-blooded Norse from Scandinavia, they were suspiciously Irish. To traditional Irish society, they were foreign, but they possessed advantages neither parent culture could match. They spoke both languages fluently. They understood both Irish tribal politics and Norse commercial networks. They could fight in the Norse shield wall and also navigate the complex honour codes of Irish warfare. Many became extremely successful as mercenaries, playing Irish kingdoms against each other and against Viking factions serving whoever paid best. The Norse Gaels eventually established their own independent power bases, particularly in the Hebrides and Isle of Man. The Kingdom of the Isles, as it became known, was neither purely Viking nor purely Irish, but something distinctly new. Its rulers bore Norse names but followed Irish succession practices. They built longships but also patronised Irish poets. They raided monasteries but also endowed them. This hybrid culture demonstrated that the Viking impact on Ireland wasn't simply destructive. It created entirely new societies that blended the best elements of both traditions. Military technology transfer worked both ways as well. Vikings adopted Irish weapons and tactics that proved effective. Irish swords, particularly those produced by master smiths, were highly valued. Vikings learned Irish guerrilla tactics, ambush strategies, and the importance of local intelligence networks. Irish warriors learned Norse formation fighting, the shield wall technique that allowed disciplined troops to defeat larger forces through superior cohesion. They learned the importance of body armour, helmets, and proper shields. Early Irish warriors had fought with minimal protection. Exposure to Viking warfare demonstrated that proper equipment wasn't cowardice, but tactical necessity. The Church's response to Viking raids evolved from initial shock and horror to pragmatic accommodation. Early monastic chronicles portrayed Vikings as divine punishment for Irish sins, a scourge sent by God to chasten a wayward people. But as the raids continued year after year, this theological explanation wore thin. By the mid-9th century, church leaders were negotiating with Vikings, paying tribute to avoid attacks, and in some cases even allying with Viking factions against rival Irish kingdoms. The Archbishop of Armagh paid protection money to Viking leaders. Monasteries maintained diplomatic relationships with Dublin's Viking rulers. Christianity itself became a tool for integrating Vikings into Irish society. When Viking leaders converted, even nominally, they gained legitimacy in Irish eyes. The conversion of the Dublin Vikings occurred gradually rather than through any single dramatic moment. Archaeological evidence shows Christian symbols appearing alongside Norse pagan imagery in Dublin by the early 10th century. Thor's hammers and Christian crosses were sometimes worn by the same individual, suggesting a syncretic approach to religion common in conversion periods. Viking burials shifted from pagan practices, with grave goods and weapons, to Christian practices with simpler interments and ecclesiastical blessing. By the late 10th century, Dublin had its own bishop, and Viking rulers were endowing churches and monasteries just as Irish kings did. This religious conversion facilitated political integration. A Christian Viking king could negotiate with Irish kings as an equal. A pagan raider could only be an enemy. The naval architecture of the longship continued evolving throughout the Viking Age in Ireland. Early longships were relatively small, perhaps 50 to 60 feet long. By the 11th century, documentary evidence and archaeological finds suggest much larger vessels. The Skudelev II ship, built in Dublin around 1042 and deliberately sunk in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, was nearly 100 feet long and could carry 70 to 80 men. This ship represents the culmination of centuries of refinement. Its timbers show construction techniques that combine traditional Norse methods with innovations developed in Ireland. The keel was scarfed together from multiple pieces rather than carved from a single timber, allowing construction of larger vessels than available timber supplies would otherwise permit. The ribs show evidence of precise prefabrication, suggesting specialized shipwrights working from standardized measurements. This was advanced engineering by any medieval standard. The sailing characteristics of these later longships were remarkable. Modern reconstructions have demonstrated that they could sail within 70 degrees of the wind direction, far closer to the wind than most contemporary European vessels. This windward performance gave Viking sailors enormous flexibility. They didn't need to wait for perfect wind conditions. They could make progress in almost any weather short of a complete calm or a direct headwind. This meant longer sailing seasons and more reliable voyage planning. A Viking fleet could commit to an operation with reasonable confidence they could execute it regardless of wind shifts. The maintenance requirements for longships were substantial but manageable. The hull needed to be hauled out and dried periodically to prevent rot. The tar sealing between planks required renewal annually. Sails wore out and needed replacement every few years. Rigging ropes had to be inspected constantly for wear. Iron rivets corroded and required replacement, But these maintenance tasks didn't require specialized shipyard facilities. A longship could be hauled up on any beach and maintained by its crew using simple tools. This self-sufficiency was crucial for Viking operations in Ireland. They didn't depend on fixed bases with sophisticated infrastructure. Any sheltered beach could serve as a temporary shipyard. The crew of a longship represented a significant social organisation. These weren't simply random warriors thrown together. A longship's crew formed a tight-knit unit that trained and fought together. Each man knew his position, his responsibilities, and his place in the ship's hierarchy. The ship's captain, usually a prominent warrior or nobleman, commanded not through formal rank but through demonstrated skill and the respect of his men. This was voluntary association. Warriors chose which ship to join based on the captain's reputation, his generosity with plunder, and his likelihood of survival. A captain who got his crew killed wouldn't find warriors willing to sail with him the next season. This voluntary nature of Viking military organisation contrasted sharply with Irish military structures. Irish armies were raised through feudal obligations. Warriors served their king because they held land from him, or owed him loyalty through kinship ties. Vikings served because they expected profit and glory. This difference in military culture gave Vikings certain advantages. Their warriors were motivated by direct material incentives. Every raid that succeeded enriched them personally. Every captive taken was potential silver in their pockets. Irish warriors fought for honour and obligation, certainly, but the economic incentives were less immediate and direct. This difference in motivation helps explain Viking persistence. They kept coming back because it paid well. The infamous reputation for Viking brutality deserves examination. Were Vikings actually more violent than their contemporaries? The evidence is mixed. Medieval warfare everywhere was brutal. Irish kingdoms routinely burned each other's territories, slaughtered populations and took hostages. What made Viking violence seem worse was its foreignness and its unpredictability. When an Irish king ravaged a rival's territory, it fit within understood social and political norms. When foreign pagans burned a monastery and enslaved monks, it seemed like a violation of cosmic order. The victim's perspective matters greatly. To the monks whose chronicles we read, Viking violence was uniquely horrifying because it came from outside the system they understood. But to a peasant whose farm was burned, whether the arsonist spoke Norse or Irish probably mattered less than the destruction itself. That said, Vikings did employ psychological warfare deliberately. The dragon-headed prows on their ships weren't just decoration, they were designed to terrify. Some sources mention that Vikings would remove these heads before entering friendly ports, suggesting they understood their intimidating effect and used it strategically. The reputation for savagery that Vikings cultivated served a practical purpose. Settlements that had heard tales of Viking brutality were more likely to surrender without resistance, pay tribute or evacuate, making raids easier and less costly in Viking casualties. Terror was a force multiplier, reducing the need for actual violence by making potential victims too frightened to resist. The economic system underlying Viking raids in Ireland operated on several levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, individual warriors sought personal profit through plunder and slave-taking. But larger structures shaped this individual behaviour. Ship captains organised and led raids, taking a larger share of profits in exchange for bearing greater risks. Fleet commanders coordinated multiple ships, sometimes dozens, requiring diplomatic skills and strategic vision beyond simple raiding. Behind all this stood the Norwegian kings and jarls who sponsored expeditions, provided ships and supplies, and expected returns on their investments. Viking raids weren't anarchic violence. They were organised business ventures with clear command structures and profit-sharing arrangements. Dublin's evolution from a seasonal raiding base to a permanent trading city created new economic dynamics. Merchants settled permanently, established warehouses, developed ongoing trading relationships with partners across the Viking world. These merchants needed stability. Constant raiding disrupted trade. Viking rulers in Dublin increasingly found themselves balancing two conflicting interests. The warriors wanted to raid for profit. The merchants wanted peace for commerce. This tension drove Dublin's leadership toward greater integration with Irish political structures. A ruler who wanted to maintain Dublin as a prosperous trading centre needed peaceful relationships with at least some Irish kingdoms to ensure trade routes remained open. and markets functioned reliably. By the early 10th century, Dublin's Viking rulers were participating in Irish politics as Irish kings would. They made alliances through marriage, they intervened in succession disputes, they collected tribute from subject territories, they endowed churches and monasteries, they sponsored poets and historians. In many ways, they had become an Irish kingdom that happened to be ruled by people of Norse descent. The longships that had brought their ancestors still lined the harbour, but now they carried merchandise as often as warriors. The transformation from raiding to trading was never complete. Dublin's rulers maintained the capacity for violence. When opportunities arose or when pressed by rivals, they could still launch devastating raids, but violence became one tool among many rather than their primary activity. The political fragmentation of Ireland made this transformation possible. Had Ireland been unified under a single powerful king, Viking settlements might have been systematically destroyed or forced out. But Ireland was divided into dozens of competing kingdoms, perpetually at war with each other. This disunity meant Irish kings often found Viking warriors useful as mercenaries or allies against Irish rivals. Vikings exploited these divisions brilliantly, playing Irish factions against each other, sometimes fighting for both sides in the same conflict at different times. The longships gave them the mobility to shift allegiances and locations quickly. A Viking band could fight for a Leinster king against a Munster king in the summer, then switch sides when offered better terms in the autumn, escaping by sea if either employer objected. The impact of Viking raids on Irish monasticism was profound and lasting. The great scriptoriums that had preserved classical learning and produced masterpieces like the Book of Kells faced repeated devastation. Many monasteries relocated to more defensible inland locations, abandoning centuries-old sites. Some communities dispersed entirely, their monks fleeing to continental Europe. The Carolingian Renaissance in Francia benefited from the arrival of Irish monks fleeing Viking raids, bringing their learning and manuscripts to continental scriptoriums. This brain drain weakened Irish intellectual life. The golden age of Irish monasticism, when Ireland was the light of learning in Dark Age Europe, ended during the Viking Age. The raids didn't destroy Irish Christianity, but they fundamentally disrupted the monastic system that had been Irish Christianity's organisational core. Yet paradoxically, Viking towns like Dublin eventually became centres of ecclesiastical authority. By the 11th century, Dublin had its own bishop with authority over Viking settlements around Ireland's coast. These bishops maintained connections to both Irish ecclesiastical structures and to Nordic Christian institutions. The Archbishop of Canterbury consecrated several Dublin bishops, creating links between Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England. The Church, having initially suffered catastrophically from Viking raids, eventually became an instrument for Viking integration into Irish and broader European Christian society. Every Viking who converted was one less raider and one more potential trading partner. The Church recognised this and actively promoted conversion, even when the sincerity of those conversions might be questionable. The genetic legacy of Vikings in Ireland has been extensively studied using modern DNA analysis. Y chromosome studies show significant Scandinavian ancestry in Irish populations, particularly in coastal areas. The highest concentrations appear precisely where historical sources indicate Viking settlements: Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick. But interestingly, the genetic impact varies by gender. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through the maternal line, shows less Scandinavian influence. This pattern suggests that Viking settlers were predominantly male, taking Irish wives. The demographics make sense. Young Norsemen sailed to Ireland seeking fortune. Those who stayed permanently married local women. Their children inherited both Norse paternal lineage and Irish maternal heritage, creating the genetic foundation of the Norse Gael population. The wider environmental and agricultural impacts of Viking settlement are harder to trace, but were probably significant. Dublin's growth into a town of several thousand required feeding populations larger than anything Ireland had supported before. Viking settlers brought Scandinavian agricultural practices, particularly in animal husbandry and dairy production. Archaeological analysis of animal bones from Viking-age Dublin shows changes in livestock breeds and butchering practices. The Vikings preferred cattle breeds different from native Irish stock, probably importing breeding animals from Scandinavia or Britain. These agricultural innovations spread beyond Viking settlements, adopted by Irish farmers who recognised their advantages. The legacy of the longship in Irish naval architecture persisted long after the Viking Age ended. When Gaelic Irish lords built galleys in the later medieval period, they used designs directly descended from Norse longships. The Berlin, the Highland galley used in Scotland's Western Isles by Norse Gael lords, was essentially a longship adapted to later medieval conditions. Irish galley fleets of the 13th and 14th centuries used clinker construction, used similar dimensions and proportions to Viking longships, and employed the same combination of oar and sail power. The technological legacy lasted centuries after the cultural identity of Vikings had dissolved into Ireland's hybrid population. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 marked not an ending but a transformation. Brian Boru's death prevented the consolidation of a unified Irish kingdom, but it also demonstrated that Vikings could no longer dominate Irish politics through military force alone. The Viking Age of raiding was over, but the Viking Age of integration continued. Dublin remained under Viking rulers for decades after Clontarf. The city continued growing, trading and minting coins. Viking and Norse Gael mercenaries continued fighting in Irish conflicts throughout the 11th century, but they fought as participants in Irish politics, not as foreign invaders. The shift was subtle but significant. When the Normans invaded Ireland in 1170, they found a complex society shaped by 2 centuries of Viking presence. The towns they conquered were Viking foundations. The trade networks they exploited were established by Norse merchants. The military tactics they faced included elements adapted from Viking warfare. Norman success in Ireland owed much to their own Norse ancestry. The Normans were descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France 2 centuries earlier. They understood Viking culture, Viking tactics, and Viking psychology in ways that purely French or English armies might not have. The Norman conquest of Ireland was, in a sense, one group of evolved Vikings conquering territories held by another group of evolved Vikings. The longships that made the Viking Age possible represented a technological achievement that shaped medieval European history. Without them, Vikings would have remained Scandinavian farmers and coastal raiders operating in the Baltic. With them, Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus, established kingdoms from Dublin to Kiev, traded from Baghdad to Iceland, and fundamentally altered the genetic, linguistic, cultural and political landscapes of Britain, Ireland, France and Eastern Europe. The longship was the essential enabler of Viking expansion. Its unique combination of shallow draft, flexible hull, speed and seaworthiness created capabilities that no contemporary European civilization could match. In Ireland specifically, the longship transformed a rural, isolated island into an urban, connected participant in European commerce and politics. The Viking towns became Ireland's economic engines. The trade networks became Ireland's connection to the wider world. The cultural fusion created a hybrid society that combined Irish and Norse elements into something uniquely Irish. When you walk through Dublin today, through streets laid out by Viking town planners over 1,000 years ago, past Christchurch Cathedral founded by the Viking king Sigtryg Silkbeard in 1028, you're experiencing the legacy of the longship. Those revolutionary vessels carried more than raiders. They carried a transformation.